There are moments in military history where a single general, outnumbered and outgunned, manages to slow the machinery of an entire army to a crawl. April 1945 may represent one of the most striking examples of that phenomenon. The Soviet Union had assembled what military historians tend to describe as the most powerful concentration of offensive force ever directed at a single front line in the history of warfare. 1 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 9,000 aircraft. All pointed toward the heart of the German Reich. And yet, for 3 days, one German general appeared to have anticipated nearly every move Georgy Zhukov made. His name was Gotthard Heinrici. Unlike many figures who commanded Germany's armies in the final years of the Second World War, he has received remarkably little attention in the popular imagination. That gap in the historical record is itself worth examining. Because the story of how Heinrici constructed one of the war's most dramatic defensive stands suggests something uncomfortable about how we tend to remember military history. We tend to remember the attackers, the commanders who moved forward, the men who captured cities and crossed rivers, the defenders who forced an attacker to pay a catastrophic price, even if they ultimately lost, often recede into footnotes. Heinrici was born in 1886 in Gumbinnen, a city in what was then East Prussia. His background was middle class and deeply Lutheran. His father was a Protestant minister, and by most accounts, that upbringing shaped something in Heinrici that would become unusual in the officer corps of the Third Reich. He appeared to carry with him a consistent moral framework that he refused to entirely set aside, even when following orders would have required him to do so. He served in the First World War and continued his military career through the interwar period, rising through the ranks of the Reichswehr and later the Wehrmacht. By the time Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Heinrici was already in his mid-50s. But his reputation as a defensive tactician was well established, and the campaigns on the Eastern Front would test it in ways that almost no other theater could replicate. The Eastern Front created a different set of problems from anything the Wehrmacht had encountered in Western Europe. The distances were staggering. The supply lines were fragile. The winters were capable of killing soldiers without a single shot being fired. And the Red Army, despite suffering catastrophic losses in the opening months of the conflict, never stopped pressing. Heinrici proved himself in that environment with a consistency that his peers found remarkable. What set him apart, according to accounts of officers who served under him, was his almost intuitive understanding of when to hold ground and when to give it up. He had an ability to read the rhythm of a Soviet offensive. The artillery preparation, the timing of infantry assaults, the patterns that repeated themselves across hundreds of miles of front line. And to respond in ways that preserved his forces while forcing the attacker to exhaust enormous resources for minimal gains. He was also known for refusing certain orders he considered both militarily senseless and morally indefensible. He reportedly resisted orders to execute Soviet prisoners of war and to terrorize civilian populations in ways that his superiors sometimes demanded. This was not the behavior of a committed ideological opponent of the regime. He served the regime. He commanded its armies. He accepted promotions from Adolf Hitler himself. But he appeared to draw personal lines at certain points that many contemporaries either did not draw or drew in very different places. The assignment that would define his historical legacy came in late March 1945, when Heinrici was given command of Army Group Vistula. Heinrich Himmler, who had been placed in command in January 1945 in what military historians generally interpret as a catastrophically poor decision driven by political rather than strategic considerations, had presided over a series of disasters and was eventually relieved. Heinrici inherited a command that was understrength, undersupplied, and positioned along one of the most consequential stretches of front line remaining in the war: the Oder River. roughly 60 kilometers east of Berlin. The Soviet forces on the other side were commanded by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, arguably the most successful military commander of the entire conflict. He was determined that it would be his forces, and not those of Ivan Konev to the south, that would take Berlin. The competitive dynamic between Zhukov and Konev, which Joseph Stalin appears to have deliberately cultivated, added pressure to an offensive already driven by enormous political urgency. Zhukov's plans centered on the Silo Heights, a ridgeline rising perhaps 30 to 50 meters above the Oder floodplain that dominated the most direct approach to Berlin from the east. Capturing that high ground was essential to his offensive. Heinrici's task was to prevent that capture for long enough to extract some meaningful outcome, whether buying time for a negotiated end, protecting civilians, or simply demonstrating that an overwhelming force could be made to pay a price Zhukov had not anticipated. What makes the next several days genuinely interesting to examine from an analytical standpoint is how much of Heinrici's defensive success appears to have rested not on superior firepower or numbers — he had neither — but on intelligence, timing, and a willingness to do something that ran against the military culture in which he had been trained. He chose to give up ground before it could be taken. The Soviet offensive was scheduled to begin on April 16, 1945. Heinrici, working from reconnaissance information and his assessment of Soviet operational patterns, believed he had identified approximately when the preliminary artillery bombardment would begin. That bombardment would be one of the most intense in the history of warfare. Soviet commanders had concentrated more than 9,000 guns and heavy mortars along the attack front. Survival in forward positions was expected to be effectively impossible. Heinrici made the decision to withdraw the bulk of his forward forces from those positions before the bombardment began. In the hours before the Soviet guns opened fire, German troops quietly pulled back from the first line of trenches and defensive works. When the bombardment hit, it largely struck empty positions. The decision appears straightforward in retrospect, but it was not at the time. Withdrawing from prepared defensive positions without orders was exactly the kind of initiative that had gotten Wehrmacht officers dismissed, arrested, or worse during the final months of the war. Hitler's standing orders emphasized holding ground at virtually any cost. The psychology of the regime by April 1945 treated retreat, even tactically sound retreat, as a form of betrayal. Heinrici made the decision anyway, and the evidence suggests he made it with a clear understanding of what he was risking. When Zhukov's forces moved forward on April 16th, they found not the suppressed, demoralized enemy the bombardment was supposed to have produced, but German forces in secondary positions, intact, waiting. Zhukov's initial assault ran into immediate difficulties. The terrain itself was problematic in ways that may not have been fully appreciated in the planning phase. The floodplain below the Silo Heights was marshy and difficult for armored vehicles to navigate. The ridgeline above provided defenders with excellent fields of fire. Roads and causeways channeling the attacking forces became bottlenecks where Soviet firepower could not always be brought to bear effectively. Zhukov made the decision in the early hours of the assault to use searchlights to blind the defenders and illuminate the battlefield for his own forces. Military historians have examined this decision at considerable length, and the consensus seems to be that it had mixed results at best. The searchlights illuminated dust and smoke from the bombardment, possibly making visibility worse in some sectors. And they provided German gunners with a reference point against which to orient their fire. For 3 days, from April 16th through approximately April 19th, the Soviet offensive made far slower progress than Zhukov had planned. The losses on both sides were severe, but the attritional cost imposed on the Soviet forces was substantially higher than pre-battle calculations had suggested. Zhukov's reputation was under strain. Stalin reportedly contacted him multiple times asking why progress was not faster, and made pointed references to the fact that Ivan Konev's forces to the south were advancing more rapidly. The pressure that created on Zhukov and the operational adjustments he made in response represent one of the more analytically interesting dimensions of the battle. Zhukov eventually committed his armored reserves earlier than originally planned, in part because the infantry assault was not achieving the needed breakthrough, and in part because the political stakes of being outpaced by Konev were considerable. That decision ultimately contributed to the fall of the Silo Heights. But it also contributed to Soviet casualties the initial battle plan had not anticipated. The Silo Heights fell on approximately April 19th. The Soviet forces began pouring through toward Berlin. The defensive stand Heinrici had constructed could not survive indefinitely against the forces arrayed against it. By the time the final German positions on the ridge collapsed, Zhukov's forces had suffered casualty figures that Soviet military planners had not anticipated when the operation was conceived. Some estimates from Soviet archival sources that became more accessible after the Cold War suggest the losses during the Silo phase were substantially higher than the official accounts indicated at the time. The precise numbers remain contested among historians, but the broad pattern, a carefully prepared defense extracting a disproportionate cost from a vastly superior attacking force, appears difficult to dispute on the available evidence. That was never a realistic expectation. The question military historians tend to ask when examining this battle is not whether Heinrici could have ultimately stopped the Soviet advance. He almost certainly could not. But whether his methods extracted a cost from the attacker that shaped what came afterward. Those questions do not have clean answers. The 3-day delay imposed on Zhukov's timetable appears to have had some effect on the overall pace of the campaign. Berlin eventually fell on May 2, 1945. The fighting in and around the city was brutal. Whether more time would have changed the political or humanitarian outcome in any significant way is something historians continue to debate. And it seems worth being cautious about any claim that Heinrici's stand decisively saved anyone or anything. The evidence does not fully support that kind of confident conclusion. What the evidence does support is that one of the most meticulously planned and numerically overwhelming offensives of the Second World War was significantly disrupted by a commander who had fewer resources, less political support, and less operational freedom than almost any other figure involved in the final campaign. Heinrici was relieved of his command on April 28, 1945, just days before the war in Europe ended. The broader context of those final days in the Reich matters here. The political and military command structure was fragmenting in ways that made coherent decision-making almost impossible. Hitler, increasingly detached from operational reality in the Berlin bunker, was still issuing orders that bore no relationship to the actual condition of the forces being commanded. In that environment, a commander who insisted on evaluating orders against military reality rather than ideological demand was, in a meaningful sense, operating in direct tension with the system he served. He had refused an order from Hitler to conduct a counterattack with forces that Heinrici judged, apparently correctly, to have no realistic chance of achieving anything other than their own destruction. The refusal led to his removal. There is a certain logical consistency to the end of his tenure that mirrors the qualities that defined it throughout. He appeared to calculate repeatedly that the difference between a militarily sound decision and an ideologically demanded one was a difference worth acknowledging, even when doing so was personally costly. He survived the war and was released from Allied captivity in 1948. He died in 1971 at the age of 85. His operational records have been studied by historians interested in defensive tactics and the specific dynamics of the Eastern Front. But he never achieved the kind of popular recognition that attaches to commanders who won dramatic offensive victories. And perhaps that is not surprising. The historical memory of the Second World War in the West has tended to organize itself around the advance. The men who held, who delayed, who extracted costs without ultimately prevailing, occupy a different and perhaps more ambiguous space in that memory. Gotthard Heinrici appears to occupy that space almost perfectly. The available evidence suggests he was a genuinely skilled commander who worked within a criminal regime without personally crossing certain lines that others crossed without apparent hesitation. How much moral weight that distinction carries is a question historians have approached from different angles and reached different conclusions about. What seems harder to dispute when the operational record is examined carefully is that the 3 days in April 1945 at the Silo Heights represent something worth examining seriously. Not as a story of heroism or tragedy in any simple sense, but as a study in what it looks like when a fundamentally outmatched commander decides to use everything he has, including the ground he is standing on. What the story of Gotthard Heinrici may ultimately suggest is something military history tends to understate. The most consequential decisions in a campaign are not always made by the side with the most resources. They are sometimes made by the commander who understands more clearly than anyone else on the field what he actually has to work with, and what he is willing to give up in order to preserve what matters. Whether that lesson applies beyond the battlefield is a question the record leaves open. If this analysis gave you something worth thinking about, hit the like button and consider subscribing for more deep dives into the commanders, decisions, and battles that shaped the modern world. Every week, we go back to the primary sources, examine what historians debate, and put together something that holds up to scrutiny. There is a lot more where this came from. And the next story might be the one you did not see coming.